Have you ever read something so shocking that it made you question everything you thought you knew? That's what happened to me when I went deeper into the Bible. Not through sermons, not through secondhand interpretations, but by actually reading the verses word for word. Some of what I discovered didn't just surprise me, it made me stop believing altogether. Today, I'll share the exact Bible verses that made me step back and say, wait, this doesn't make sense.
Stick with me until the end, because I'm not here to bash anyone's faith, but to show you the same verses that completely changed my perspective. One of the first things that shook me was reading the creation accounts in Genesis. Most people are familiar with the story. God creates the world in 6 days, then rests on the seventh. But when you carefully compare Genesis chapter 1 with Genesis chapter 2, you notice something strange. The order of creation isn't consistent.
In Genesis 1, animals are created before man and woman, yet in Genesis 2, Adam is formed first, then the animals, and later Eve. These aren't small differences, they're direct contradictions. For me, this raised a serious question. If this book is supposed to be divinely inspired, why can't it get the foundational story of creation straight? How could a perfect God allow two conflicting accounts of the same event? That realization began to open my eyes to the possibility that maybe this book wasn't as flawless as I was always told. Another verse that hit me hard was in Deuteronomy 20:16-17, where God commands the Israelites to completely destroy entire cities, men, women, and children. This wasn't self-defense, it was genocide ordered in God's name. As someone who grew up believing in a loving, merciful God, this was impossible to reconcile. Why would a God of compassion demand the slaughter of innocents? People often try to justify it by saying it was God's will or part of a bigger plan, but that explanation always felt hollow. Reading these verses made me ask, if I wouldn't accept this behavior from a human leader, why should I accept it from a divine one? To me, it painted a picture of a deity that looked less like a source of love and more like a warlord demanding absolute loyalty. That shook the foundation of my faith. When I got to passages like Matthew 25:46, then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life, I struggled deeply. The idea that a loving God would condemn people to eternal torment for finite mistakes never made sense. Eternal punishment doesn't match the crime of being human, doubting, or even being born into the wrong faith. If God is just, then eternal damnation feels wildly disproportionate. Think about it. A child born in a remote village who never hears about Christianity is supposedly doomed forever? That seemed less like divine justice and more like divine cruelty. This verse was one of the biggest turning points for me because it clashed with everything I was taught about love, forgiveness, and mercy. It made me wonder, who benefits from keeping people afraid of eternal punishment? Another verse that completely changed how I viewed the Bible was 1 Timothy 2:12, where Paul says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man, she must be quiet." I remember reading this and thinking, this isn't divine wisdom, this is blatant sexism. If the Bible is supposed to be timeless truth, why would God silence half of humanity? Even worse, many churches still use this verse to suppress women's voices, keeping them out of leadership positions. Growing up, I saw how damaging this was, and reading it in black and white only confirmed it. To me, it wasn't God speaking, it was Paul's cultural bias being passed off as holy scripture. This verse was a breaking point, because it revealed that the Bible didn't transcend human flaws, it reflected them. Finally, one of the most haunting passages was Psalm 22:1. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Even Jesus is depicted as feeling abandoned by God. If even the Son of God could cry out in despair, what hope did ordinary believers have? I realized that this verse unintentionally exposed something most people won't admit. Faith often feels like talking to silence. I spent years praying, waiting for answers that never came. And when I read verses like this, it struck me, even within the Bible, God often seems absent. That realization didn't strengthen my faith, it broke it. For me, it wasn't just about logic or morality anymore. It was about honesty. The Bible itself seemed to admit the silence that believers try so hard to deny. In Exodus 34:14, God declares, "Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." That verse alone startled me. I grew up being taught that jealousy was a human weakness, a flaw of insecurity. Yet here was the supposed perfect creator of the universe admitting to jealousy. Why would an all-powerful being need to feel threatened by humans worshiping other gods, especially if those gods supposedly don't exist? To me, this didn't sound like divine strength. It sounded like fragile ego. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized that this verse portrayed God less as a being of infinite power and love, and more like a controlling ruler who couldn't tolerate free thought. That revelation was a major push away from faith. Genesis 22 is often praised as a story of faith, but for me, it was horrifying. God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as a test of obedience. Think about that. A father is commanded to kill his child. Even though the angel stops him at the last second, the very idea that God would demand such a test is disturbing. What kind of loving deity plays psychological games with his followers by asking them to commit murder? If this is the model of faith, it's not inspiring, it's terrifying.
Instead of showcasing divine goodness, the story reveals manipulation and cruelty. That verse was one of the clearest moments where I realized that blind obedience was valued more than compassion. In Exodus 9:12, it says, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and he would not listen." This shocked me because it directly removes Pharaoh's free will. If God deliberately hardened his heart, then Pharaoh wasn't responsible for his actions. Yet God still punishes Egypt with plagues and suffering.
This makes no sense. Why would a supposedly just God interfere with someone's choices, only to condemn them afterward? For me, it raised a disturbing possibility that free will doesn't exist in the biblical worldview. If God controls hearts and minds, then punishing people for those controlled actions is unjust. This verse was another clear crack in the idea of divine fairness. Exodus 20:17, part of the Ten Commandments, includes the line, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." Notice how the wife is listed alongside livestock and property. She isn't described as a person with autonomy, but as something a man owns. Reading this made me realize how deeply the Bible reflects the patriarchal culture of its time, not timeless truth. If the Ten Commandments are supposed to be the ultimate moral law, why would God reinforce a worldview where women are reduced to property? For me, this verse alone disqualified the Bible as a source of universal morality. The book of Job is often framed as a lesson in faith, but when I read Job 1:12, I was stunned. God allows Satan to torment Job just to prove a point. Job loses his wealth, his children, and his health, not because of anything he did wrong, but because of a cosmic bet. To me, that wasn't divine justice, it was cruelty. Why would a loving God treat a faithful man's life as a game? This verse shattered the comforting idea that suffering always has meaning. Sometimes, the Bible seems to admit that suffering is random, inflicted not by evil humans, but by God's own permission. That realization made me deeply uneasy and pushed me further from belief. Genesis 7 describes the flood, where God wipes out nearly all life on earth. I couldn't reconcile this with the idea of a merciful God. If humans had sinned, why kill animals, children, and innocent people too? Imagine drowning the entire world because you're disappointed in humanity. That doesn't sound like love. It sounds like wrath on a scale we can't even comprehend. Reading this story as an adult, I realized it wasn't a tale of redemption. It was a mass extinction ordered by God. The more I thought about it, the less I could see God as merciful, and the more I saw him as vengeful and destructive. In Leviticus 25:44-46, God explicitly permits slavery. You may buy male and female slaves from the nations around you. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property. This wasn't a temporary practice. This was a divine law.
If God truly gave humanity a moral compass, why would he endorse treating human beings as property? Some believers try to justify it as different from modern slavery, but the reality is the same: ownership of people. For me, this was the verse that made it impossible to claim the Bible was a flawless moral guide. A just and loving God would never sanction slavery in any form. In Mark 11:13-14, Jesus curses a fig tree for not bearing fruit, even though it wasn't the season for figs. The tree withers and dies. This verse baffled me. Why would Jesus, supposedly the embodiment of patience and wisdom, curse a tree for not producing something it biologically couldn't? Some say it's symbolic, but even then, the symbolism is harsh and unreasonable. It revealed a pettiness that clashed with the image of a compassionate teacher. For me, it wasn't divine power, it was unnecessary cruelty. This passage made me realize that not everything Jesus did could be seen as perfect.
In 2 Samuel 6:7, Uzzah reaches out to steady the Ark of the Covenant when it starts to tip, and God strikes him dead for touching it. Imagine that. He was only trying to help. Instead of rewarding his good intention, God kills him instantly. This made me question the very concept of divine justice. How could a supposedly loving God punish someone for preventing an accident? To me, it wasn't about holiness or reverence, it was about authoritarian control.
This verse painted a picture of a God who valued rules over human life, and that shook me deeply. In Revelation 21:8, it says that the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. Notice that the unbelieving are listed alongside murderers and liars. That verse hit me hard because it condemned people not for evil actions, but simply for disbelief. So if you doubt, if you question, you're doomed to eternal fire? That's not justice, that's thought control. Reading this made me realize how fear-based the entire system of belief was. It wasn't about truth, it was about obedience. As I grew older and learned more about the natural world, I realized the Bible offered no accurate explanation for it. For example, Leviticus 11:6 incorrectly describes the rabbit as chewing cud. The Bible presents a worldview of flat earth cosmology, with a firmament above and waters below. For a book supposedly inspired by an all-knowing God, why does it contain so many errors about the natural world? These verses stood out because they reflected ancient human misunderstanding, not divine knowledge. For me, it was proof that the Bible was written by people who simply didn't know better. In Numbers 31:17-18, Moses, following God's command, tells his soldiers, "Now kill all the boys. And kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." This verse horrified me. It's not just war, it's genocide combined with sexual slavery. For me, this verse revealed the ugliest side of the Bible, a God who endorses violence and exploitation. If this is divine morality, I wanted no part in it. The resurrection is the cornerstone of Christianity, but when I read the gospel accounts side by side, they didn't match. Who went to the tomb first? Was the stone already rolled away? Were there angels, or one angel, or two? These details shift between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If this was the most important event in human history, why is the record so inconsistent? For me, it wasn't just small differences. It was evidence that the accounts were written by humans, each with their own version. That cracked the foundation of belief in the resurrection itself. Romans 9:13 quotes God saying, "Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated." That verse shattered the idea of an impartial, loving God. How can a deity of justice hate one person and love another before they even act? It revealed divine favoritism that contradicted fairness. For me, this was another sign that the Bible reflected human tribalism rather than universal truth. In Matthew 10:34, Jesus says, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Growing up, I was taught Jesus was the Prince of Peace. Yet here, he openly says his message will bring division and conflict. This made me realize that Christianity wasn't about harmony.
It was about separation, us versus them. That verse exposed the divisive nature of faith and made me question the entire message I had once found comforting. In Genesis 19:8, Lot offers his virgin daughters to an angry mob to protect two male visitors. Reading this left me horrified. This was supposed to be the story of a righteous man protected by God, yet his solution to danger was offering up his children for sexual violence. Instead of condemning this, the Bible moves forward as if it were acceptable. To me, this verse shattered any illusion that biblical morality could be considered timeless or divine. If this is righteousness, I wanted nothing to do with it.
Exodus 12:29 describes God striking down every firstborn in Egypt, from the Pharaoh's son to the child of a prisoner. I couldn't reconcile this with the idea of love. Children, innocent of their ruler's actions, were slaughtered in the night. Imagine a God who punishes the powerless to make a statement against the powerful. That verse made me realize how often the Bible depicts collateral damage as justice.
Instead of showing divine mercy, it showed divine cruelty, and it broke my trust in the text. Jude 1:7 explains that Sodom and Gomorrah suffered the punishment of eternal fire. I couldn't help but wonder, why eternal? Why infinite punishment for finite actions? And even more, why destroy entire cities, including children, animals, and innocent people? For me, this verse revealed a theology rooted in fear and destruction rather than forgiveness.
It suggested that God's response to disobedience was not correction, but annihilation. That level of cruelty felt deeply human, not divine. In 1 Corinthians 14:34, Paul says, "Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak." This wasn't metaphorical, it was a direct command. For me, it confirmed that the Bible reflected the sexism of its time. Instead of lifting humanity to a higher standard, it entrenched inequality.
If the Bible was truly divine, wouldn't it have transcended cultural biases? Reading this, I couldn't see divine inspiration. I saw patriarchy being sanctified. Numbers 15:32-36 tells of a man who was stoned to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath. His crime? Collecting wood. God commanded his execution, and the community carried it out. This verse deeply unsettled me. If the Sabbath was meant to be a day of rest and holiness, how could death be the penalty for breaking it? This wasn't justice, it was legalistic brutality. For me, it exposed the emptiness of divine law when applied without compassion. In Genesis 11, humanity unites to build a tower, but God confuses their language and scatters them. Reading this as an adult, I wondered, why would a God of unity deliberately sow division? Instead of celebrating human cooperation and creativity, God punishes it. To me, this verse revealed a deity who feared human progress and sought to limit it.
That felt less like divine wisdom and more like human rulers keeping control. Leviticus 1-7 is filled with instructions for burnt offerings, blood sacrifices, and rituals. God seems obsessed with the smell of burning flesh. It is a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Reading these verses made me question why an all-powerful being would need constant animal slaughter to be appeased. Was God truly nourished by the scent of death?
For me, it was clear these rituals reflected ancient human religion, not the desires of a transcendent deity. Luke 14:26 has Jesus saying, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." This verse cut deep. Instead of family love, it demanded loyalty through rejection and hatred. To me, this wasn't spiritual wisdom, it was cult-like control.
The fact that such words came from Jesus himself made me question his entire message. In John 3:18, it says, "Whoever does not believe stands condemned already." I realized belief wasn't about actions, kindness, or morality. It was about blind acceptance. If you didn't believe, you were condemned. That's not justice, that's coercion. To me, this verse revealed that Christianity wasn't about truth, it was about compliance. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it.
James 1:6 warns that anyone who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. Doubt is condemned, not celebrated. Yet doubt is the very foundation of inquiry, growth, and discovery. Why would a God who gave us minds reject us for questioning? To me, this verse showed that faith demanded submission, not exploration. And once I realized that, faith lost its hold on me. In Hosea 13:16, it says, "Their little ones shall be dashed in pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open."
I remember reading this verse in disbelief. How could such graphic violence be described as God's judgment? This wasn't metaphorical, it was brutality. It made me see that the God of the Bible wasn't just indifferent. He was often portrayed as actively cruel. That revelation marked another breaking point in my belief. Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. On the surface, it sounds poetic.
But when I examined it closely, I realized it was telling me to trust without evidence. Blind faith wasn't a virtue, it was a tool of control. This verse crystallized why belief felt empty. It asked me to abandon reason. Revelation 22:15 describes who will be outside God's city: the dogs, those who practice magic arts, the sexually immoral, the murderers, the idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. But I noticed, again, belief was the central measure.